Every empire has a creation myth. For the modern dollar empire, that myth is wrapped not in glory, but in collapse. The world remembers the Great Depression as a time of hunger, bank runs, and mass unemployment. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. While Europe sank into chaos and currency failures, the United States began quietly repositioning itself. This wasn't just a recovery, it was a takeover. America didn't just survive the 1930s. It transformed the global economic order. Gold poured into New York. London lost its grip. And the US dollar, once seen as unstable, began its rise as the new pillar of power. Crises destroy the weak, but they crown the prepared. And in that dark decade, Washington laid the blueprint for a financial empire that would dominate the world for the next century. Through dollars, not armies. Most people never saw it coming, and fewer still understood it was by design. In the early 1930s, as economies across Europe imploded, the United States watched and waited. The Great Depression had brought devastation at home, but abroad it was pure collapse. Germany's banking system disintegrated. Austria defaulted. Britain, the old king of finance, abandoned the gold standard in 1931, triggering a domino effect. Panic spread. Currencies devalued. Gold fled every capital. Except one. America, though wounded, remained the last perceived stronghold of monetary discipline. While others printed and burned, the U.S. hoarded. Gold flowed into its vaults like blood to a beating heart. The world, desperate for stability, unknowingly crowned a new ruler. But this shift wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The U.S. passed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, devaluing the dollar against gold, boosting exports, and tightening control over its reserve. Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't just managing a crisis. He was positioning America to inherit the future. As Europe turned inward, consumed by war, fascism, and debt, Washington focused outward. It built alliances through money, not ideology. American banks grew stronger. U.S. treasuries became a lifeline. And Wall Street, not Westminster, became the place the world watched. The groundwork for Bretton Woods was already being poured. This was no coincidence. The Depression acted like controlled demolition. Old financial powers crumbled, clearing space for something new. America didn't conquer the world with tanks. It did it with timing, liquidity, and control. By the end of the decade, the dollar was no longer a national currency. It was a global benchmark. The Great Depression was the storm. The U.S. was the ark. And as the waters rose, the world had no choice but to climb aboard. From chaos came order, but not by chance. This was the beginning of a system designed to reward crisis readiness, punish weakness, and concentrate power in the hands of those who could hold the line while others drowned. The Great Depression did more than devastate economies. It reshuffled the global balance of power. In the 1920s, Britain still stood as the world's financial heart, with London dictating the terms of global trade and capital flows. But by the time the 1930s ended, that center had shifted. Slowly, then suddenly, the United States emerged, not just as a survivor, but as the architect of a new monetary order. The transformation wasn't loud. There were no grand speeches announcing American dominance. Instead, there were quiet defaults, silent capital flights, closed borders, and shuttered banks across Europe. Each collapse sent more gold, more trust, more financial weight toward the United States. While others devalued recklessly, America initially held firm. It projected a sense of stability, even if the reality inside its borders was grim. That perception mattered. In global finance, perception becomes policy. When Britain left the gold standard in 1931, it broke the sacred link between currency and gold for the first time among major powers. The pound collapsed. Confidence shattered. Empire debts became suspect overnight. As nations watched the British retreat from financial leadership, they began shifting reserves, contracts, and long-term trust toward the dollar. The U.S. became the last man standing, not because it was unscathed, but because it hadn't moved yet. Then in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt made a controversial move. He closed the gold window domestically, outlawed private gold holdings, and began a process of revaluing the dollar. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 was the final blow. By raising the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, the U.S. effectively devalued the dollar by nearly 70%, but only after it had secured the world's gold. In other words, America changed the rules only after gathering the pieces. This wasn't panic. It was strategy. This move did several things at once. It stimulated U.S. exports by making American goods cheaper. It increased the value of the gold reserves the government held, strengthening its financial position. And it signaled to the world that the United States was not just a player in the system, it was willing to redesign. But the real shift wasn't about price. It was about centralization. The federal government, through the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, took full control of the nation's gold, currency, and credit. In the past, gold had been distributed among private banks and citizens. Now it was consolidated. Power was no longer decentralized. It was concentrated. And that concentration would form the spine of the dollar empire for decades to come. As Europe slipped further into chaos, with Hitler rising, Mussolini marching, and civil wars breaking out, the U.S. became the lender of last resort, the vault of last resort, and the narrative of last resort. The New Deal wasn't just domestic policy. It was a signal. America could act, restructure, and rebuild faster than its rivals. While European leaders debated austerity, America spent. While others rationed, America printed. But always with control. The Federal Reserve wasn't just managing monetary policy. It was managing the future. Every bond issued, every dollar printed, every gold bar stored reinforced the emerging idea that in crisis, trust flows to America. Not because it was morally superior, but because it moved first, took bold action, and projected strength. In a world on fire, the country that looked least on fire became king. By the end of the 1930s, a quiet reality had taken hold. The dollar had begun its transformation into an international standard. Not yet formalized, but already dominant in practice. U.S. banks had access to capital while European institutions struggled. American corporations expanded abroad while others folded. The war would accelerate the trend, but the foundation was laid before the first shot was fired. The U.S. was no longer just a country. It was becoming a financial axis around which the rest of the world would rotate. The critical moment wasn't just Bretton Woods in 1944. It was this decade of collapse and repositioning. Without the Depression, there would be no dollar empire. The suffering of millions concealed a geopolitical shift, pain for the many, positioning for the few. It's tempting to see this era as one of natural evolution. America was destined to lead. But that's a myth. The truth is more calculated. The U.S. used timing, legislation, capital controls, and monetary engineering to redirect global flows. It didn't just emerge stronger. It took strength from others. While Britain defaulted on debts to its colonies, America refinanced Latin American nations with strings attached. While European investors fled their homelands, U.S. markets absorbed their capital under tight terms. Every crisis was a chance to write new rules. And America wrote them in English, backed by dollars stored in gold. The empire wasn't built through conquest. It was built through collapse, just not its own. This same playbook is reappearing. In the 2020s, as recession fears mount and global debt balloons, we see echoes of the 1930s. China is grappling with internal deflation and capital flight. Europe is trapped in energy shocks and political fragmentation. Emerging markets drown in dollar-denominated debt. And yet again, the U.S., with its high interest rates and safe bonds, is attracting global capital like a magnet. The world complains about American dominance, but every crisis drives it deeper. The pattern is familiar: collapse elsewhere, centralization in the U.S. followed by global financial domination. We call it the dollar system. But in truth, it's a crisis machine. And every time it breaks the world, it rebuilds it in its own image. The 1930s wasn't just a tragedy. It was a template. And that template is alive and well. The 2020s are not the 1930s, but the rhyme is unmistakable. Once again, the world stands on the edge of economic fracture. Once again, currencies are losing credibility, debts are piling up, and trust is vanishing faster than liquidity. And just like nearly a century ago, the United States stands at the center, not because it's the most stable, but because it's perceived as the least unstable. In the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, the Federal Reserve unleashed a monetary flood. Zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and trillions in fiscal stimulus created an artificial calm. But beneath the surface, the seeds of the next shift were already taking root. Inflation returned, supply chains fractured, and one by one central banks around the world began losing the confidence of their citizens. Some printed their way into currency collapse. Others tightened too late. And in that fog of confusion, the U.S. made its next move, aggressively raising rates while the world hesitated. This is not just monetary policy. It's geopolitical engineering. High interest rates attract capital. And in a world where trillions of dollars are searching for shelter, even 5% yields on U.S. Treasuries become irresistible. That capital inflow strengthens the dollar, weakens other currencies, and begins a new cycle of dollar dependence. Argentina burns. Turkey bleeds. China tightens capital controls to stem outflows. And yet again, the same pattern emerges. The U.S. watches as others collapse, then offers the arc. In the 1930s, the U.S. absorbed gold. In the 2020s, it absorbs capital. Different tools, same strategy, die to art. Crisis breeds flight. Flight breeds centralization. And centralization breeds domination. The dollar becomes not just a currency, but a chokehold. It dominates trade, debt, pricing, and political leverage. China, for all its economic size, still struggles to challenge this system. Its yuan is not fully convertible. Its financial system remains opaque. Its state-controlled economy breeds caution in foreign investors. And worse, when crisis hits, as in the Evergrande collapse or tech crackdowns, Beijing tightens its grip instead of opening doors. That behavior frightens global capital. In contrast, the U.S., even in dysfunction, maintains the illusion of openness, legal transparency, and financial depth. That illusion is powerful, because in finance, perception creates flow, and flow creates empire. When capital flows toward you, the world bends to your rules. You don't need to invade. You just need to set the interest rate. Bretton Woods may be dead, but the architecture it created still functions. The IMF, the World Bank, SWIFT, credit rating agencies, dollar clearing networks, all remnants of that post-depression, post-WWE structure. And even as new institutions emerge, none rival the reach of the U.S.-centric financial web. Countries talk about de-dollarization, but in practice, when crisis hits, they rush into treasuries. They don't trust each other. They trust the system they were trained to depend on. This isn't loyalty. It's conditioning. Generations of finance ministers, central bankers, and sovereign debt managers have internalized one truth: when in doubt. This is how the empire sustains itself, not by growth, but by being the fallback option in every panic. And the panic is always coming. Recession, war, debt ceiling drama, energy crisis, bank failures. Each event creates tremors. Each tremor shakes loose weaker economies. And each time, capital returns to the U.S. not because it's just, but because it's known. This is the modern version of 1934's gold hoarding. Only now, it's ETFs, dollar swaps, Fed liquidity lines, and global reserve float. When the world breaks, it doesn't seek solutions. It seeks refuge. And America, despite its flaws, remains the default sanctuary. But sanctuaries come with rules. When countries rely on the dollar, they subject themselves to American influence. Sanctions become weapons. Debt becomes leverage. Trade becomes discipline. You want access? Follow the script. Disobey? lose the lifeline. That's the hidden cost of the modern dollar empire. It appears neutral, just a currency, just a system. But behind that neutrality lies a hierarchy. And at the top sits the only player allowed to print the global fallback. Every crisis reinforces that privilege. Every collapse expands its reach. And every recovery deepens its control. The empire doesn't need new land. It needs new volatility. Because in volatility, it thrives. The goal is not stability, it's dominance through managed chaos. The US can afford debt because others buy it. It can run deficits because others finance them. It can export inflation because others absorb it. And as long as the world remains afraid, fractured, and financially insecure, the dollar's grip only tightens. Just like the 1930s, collapse is not a threat to the empire. It's the fuel that feeds it. The only difference is the speed. What once took a decade now unfolds in quarters. And while the faces change, the structure doesn't. The arc is still there. The flood is still coming. And the door once again is controlled by Washington. The illusion of safety is the most powerful tool in finance. And the dollar system is built entirely on that illusion. When markets tremble, when currencies crash, when governments falter, there's an almost instinctive reaction. Flee. It doesn't matter if the US is also in trouble. It doesn't matter if debt is exploding or politics are dysfunctional. What matters is perception. And perception says the dollar may be flawed, but everything else is worse. That thinking didn't emerge naturally. It was manufactured. It was forged in the fire of the Great Depression, codified after World War II, and reinforced through decades of financial crises, each one pulling the world deeper into dollar dependency. This is how an empire maintains itself without firing a shot. It simply becomes the one thing no one can afford to live without. But behind the smooth rhetoric of stability and reserve currency lies a brutal structure. The modern dollar empire is not a partnership. It's a hierarchy. At the top sits the US government, able to borrow in its own currency at will. Beneath it are global institutions that echo its monetary logic. Further down are developing nations who must acquire dollars to import fuel, food, medicine, or to repay debt. And at the bottom are populations who suffer when their leaders fail to secure enough dollars to keep the economy afloat. This system is enforced not by force, but by structure. SWIFT, the IMF, credit ratings, cross-border settlements, all of them quietly punish deviation. If your nation breaks ranks, your currency collapses. Your capital flees. Your borrowing costs spike. You get the message: comply or collapse. Even powerful nations aren't immune. In recent years, Russia was cut out of dollar systems. China has watched closely. Iran was isolated financially long before it faced bombs. These are not just geopolitical decisions. They are monetary weapons. And they're only possible because the dollar is the medium through which global transactions flow. Control the medium, and you control behavior. That's why alternatives, like BRICS de-dollarization push or CBT, face so much resistance. They don't just challenge US dominance. They challenge the illusion of inevitability. And that illusion is everything. Break it and the system cracks. Preserve it and the empire endures. This is why crisis is not feared, it's welcomed. Every collapse elsewhere is a test. Can the dollar hold? Will capital return? And every time it does, the myth deepens. In 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, nations learned the price of dollar shortages. In 2008, during the global meltdown, the Fed's liquidity lines became the world's oxygen tank. In 2020, as COVID froze global trade, the dollar spiked before the Fed stepped in to ease the pain. The pattern is always the same: fear, flight, flood, then compliance. No one questions who benefits. They just thank the lifeguard while ignoring who stirs the waters. This system isn't sustainable, but it is self-reinforcing. And that's more dangerous. Every crisis strengthens the empire's grip. Every rescue rewrites the rules. And every nation that falls back in line proves the model works. The dollar doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be dominant when it counts. And as long as the world measures safety in dollars, the US holds the only vote that matters. This isn't just a financial structure. It's a psychological one. And the Great Depression was its founding trauma. Everything since has been reinforcement. The empire isn't expanding. It's deepening. Not through conquest, but through collapse. There's a cruel paradox at the heart of the dollar empire. The more the world breaks, the stronger it becomes. This isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system, and it was never meant to benefit everyone. In fact, it only works if most lose and a few win. Every recession, every banking panic, every currency crisis is an opportunity, not for reform, but for consolidation. While nations scramble to stabilize, the U.S. consolidates its grip. While others burn reserves to defend their currencies, America prints the one asset they're all chasing. Power flows to those who issue the oxygen in a fire. And in a global inferno of instability, the dollar becomes breath itself. But that breath comes with terms. When countries take IMF loans, they don't just get dollars, they get rules. When central banks hold U.S. treasuries, they're not just seeking safety, they're subsidizing American deficits. When corporations settle trade in dollars, they don't just use a neutral medium, they accept U.S. jurisdiction over their financial lives. This isn't just dominance. It's dependence disguised as choice. And that dependence deepens with every new crisis. The more volatile the world becomes, the more vital the dollar feels. It's a trap wrapped in reassurance. Even within the U.S., this empire doesn't lift all boats. It creates financial elites, asset bubbles, and capital flows that benefit a shrinking segment of the population. The same system that pulls global wealth into dollar-denominated assets also pushes domestic inequality to historic highs. Wall Street booms while Middle America drowns in debt. The empire feeds on flows of money, power, and narrative. And if those flows must come from collapse, so be it. The lesson of the 1930s wasn't just how to survive crisis. It was how to design around it. To make panic profitable. To make collapse strategic. The modern dollar empire wasn't an accident. It was engineered, built to rise from the ashes, not to prevent the fire. This is the truth most never see. The dollar didn't conquer the world through strength. It inherited a broken system and rewrote the rules in its favor. And it did so not during peace, but during panic. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic tragedy. It was the proving ground for a new kind of empire, one that doesn't need armies, only access. One that doesn't need to invade, only to lend. One that rises each time the world falls. From 1930s, golden flows, to 2020s, capital surges, the story hasn't changed. Collapse is not the end, it's the gateway. And America built the only gate that matters. We are now living through the echoes of that design. Every default, every emerging market crisis, every rush into U.S. assets is a reenactment of that original template. People may scream about de-dollarization, multipolarity, or financial sovereignty. But when panic hits, they don't run to yuan, euro, or gold. They run to dollars. Not because it's fair, but because there's no alternative with teeth. That's the empire's greatest trick. It turns every crisis into a loyalty test. And the world, time and time again, submits. This instability, it's a cycle of managed instability, where the center survives by watching the edges burn. The 1930s taught the U.S. how to absorb collapse, centralize power, and dominate from the shadows. That lesson became policy. That policy became structure. And that structure became invisible. But it's still here. Every recession reveals it. Every bailout confirms it. Every crisis rewards it. The empire doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs you to need it when it counts. And in that moment of desperation, the deal is sealed all over again.